Okay, well, I'll go ahead and get us started. So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Alexandra Campbell. I'm the Executive Director for the Reston Historic Trust and Museum. The museum is located on Lake Ann Plaza, and our mission is to preserve the past, inform the present, and influence the future of Reston through educational programs such as this one. Tonight, we will begin exploring the history of the area before it was known as Reston. We're going to start looking at individuals who lived on the property, and then we're going to touch on a few historic places that you can still visit today. Before we get started, I do want to make a few notes. We're going to be recording tonight's program, and we ask that if you have any questions to type them into the chat box. We'll take questions at the end. And I also want to thank Reston Community Center, who supports our programs and has made tonight's presentation possible. So let's get started. So our journey begins hundreds of years ago. Before European settlement, the Chesapeake Bay watershed was home to Native American tribes. In this area, it was the Dogue tribe who lived here, and this tribe was independent of the Powhatan tribe. They traveled throughout the region, depending on the season, and used the land to quarry stone and grow crops. They hunted for food and used deerskin for clothing. Their homes and outbuildings were made of woven mats or bark and attached to pole frames. A central opening in the ceiling allowed smoke to escape from cooking fires. The tribe was heavily impacted by the epidemic of smallpox, and those who survived eventually left the area after the Susquehannock War and with the increased European settlement that occurred in the late 1670s. On the screen here, we have a map of Virginia from 1608. It was done by John Smith. And on exhibit at the museum, the next time you visit, you can see a Piscataway Point that was found in this area. King Charles II of England, pictured here on the slide, encouraged European settlement to America. Charles II had a rather rocky reign and was for a time exiled to Europe for about 10 years. In 1659, he was restored to the English throne, and to reward those who had remained loyal to him throughout the conflict, Charles II awarded property to America to 7 English gentlemen. This property was referred to as Northern Neck and included area that would become Reston, but also other parts of Fairfax County, Loudoun County, and Prince William County. Lord Thomas Culpeper was one of the 7 Englishmen who received property from the king. His grandson, another Thomas, would inherit the property. He was born at Leeds Castle in Kent and also had the titles of Baron of Cameron and 6th Lord Fairfax. Lord Fairfax would move to Virginia in 1747. Reston, of course, has a street that bears his name, and Fairfax County is named after him as well. And here on the slide is an image of Baron of Cameron. While the property changed hands a few more times with different Fairfaxes owning the property, our next focus will be on the Thornton ownership. After immigrating from England in 1848, Benjamin Thornton settled in Richmond, Virginia. He owned property throughout Virginia and owned property that had belonged to James Madison, Lord Fairfax, and Robert King Carter. In 1852, he purchased 2 adjacent parcels of land that comprised of over 8,000 acres of land from Reginald Fairfax for about $5 an acre. This is the area that relates to Reston. Benjamin, however, was an absentee owner, and he relied on his brother Joseph to settle on the property and manage their lumber business. Joseph built a 14-room Gothic Revival style house on the property, which is featured here on the slide. And the windows in particular demonstrate that Gothic Revival style. It was destroyed by a fire in 1955. The WNOD, which we'll touch on a little bit later, was built during this time. And during this time, the area was also referred to as Thornton Mill. The Civil War was an important historic event that took place during the Thornton ownership. And while no battles took place on the property, troops did move throughout the area. A cannonball is a part of the exhibit at the Reston Museum and is believed to be from the Battle of Dranesville and is shown here on the slide. Unfortunately, Benjamin Thornton went broke after the Civil War, and in 1886, the land was sold for a little over $3 an acre to Dr. Carl Adolph Max Wiehle and William McKee Dunn. When Wiehle and Dunn purchased the property, they quickly split the land between them. Wiehle took the northern portion above the WNOD, and Loring took the south. Dunn took the south. Dunn partnered with George B. Loring to develop a resort community on the property. However, Dunn died in 1887 during the early stages of development, and Dunn's wife, Elizabeth, would inherit the property and sold it to the Fairfax Lumber Company. A community called Dunn Loring eventually developed on a separate tract of West Falls Church outside of the Reston area that Dunn and Loring had also purchased. And of course, today we have the Dunn Loring Metro Station. Tonight, we're going to focus more on Wiehle, and so to orient ourselves, we have a map here on the slide. So this red circle area is where Wiehle started planning his town, and it's situated just above the Dulles Toll Road. Wiehle was born in Germany, but he grew up in Philadelphia. Wiehle was able to retire early at the age of 41, and he dedicated his retirement to building the town of Wiehle. He planned for a town of 800 houses that 4,000 people could live in. A church, several homes, a hotel, and a few other buildings, and even hand-dug lakes were constructed. The church also functioned as a town hall and a hardware store. Wiehle got approval from the U.S. Postal Office to change the name from Thornton Mill to Wiehle. Despite this progress, Wiehle's plan to create a town did not come to fruition. Less than a dozen houses were built before his death in 1901 from pneumonia. Today, Reston has a street named Wiehle and also the metro station. And as we'll see in a few moments, a few Wiehle-era buildings have survived to today. Here on the left is a drawing of the town of Wiehle. In the foreground is the small lake, which you can still see today. There's a bridge here, and this building here is the Town Hall Church hardware store. On the right here is the map of Wiehle, and Wiehle had hired Joseph Barry to help him plan the town, and this is what they came up with. The streets are very grid-like, with the exception of the small area here with meandering streets that comprises of a forest area. Street names that they imagined Wiehle having included London Avenue and Paris Avenue. Down here, this is where the lake is again, the WNOD here. And this area in the bottom right-hand corner was reserved for industry. This image is from a 1980s guide of the area, pointing out several historic Wiehle buildings and elements. And so again, we have the lake is shown here, and the buildings on the screen include residences, a warehouse, a bathhouse, and an ice house. Now we'll discuss some Wiehle era buildings. During the time that Wiehle was planning his town, he actually resided in Washington, D.C., and he used his Virginia property mostly during the summer. And so he constructed what was referred to as the Wiehle Summer House in 1887. It was in the Victorian style and featured a generous porch. The Wiehle gazebo was right outside the Wiehle mansion, was built circa 1900. The gazebo that can be seen today is not the original, as it was rebuilt in the 1970s. The DeMoss House tour guide described the gazebo as in the classic Victorian style, and you can see that particularly with the roof of the gazebo. It was constructed of redwood, and at one point there were built-in benches in the gazebo, but by the 1980s, these benches were gone. So you can see the gazebo from Old Reston Avenue today. On the left here is an older picture, and on the right here we have a picture that was taken this year. The Wiehle Mansion was built after the summer house was built in 1899. It is also located on Old Reston Avenue. The Wiehle Mansion was drawn up by Erickson and Sunderland of a Washington architectural firm, and the Wiehle Mansion had 25 rooms. The mansion went through several name changes over the year, including the Big House, the Smith-Bowman House, and under the Prison Fellowship Ministry's ownership in the 1980s, it was referred to as the DeMoss House. Today, it is an office building. As the DeMoss House in the 80s, it was a center for hospitality, prayer, and fellowship, and also used as a bed and breakfast. The DeMoss House tour guide describes the mansion as having welcoming porches, 18-inch thick walls, 35 windows, and 3 chimneys. There was a formal garden, a pool house, and a pool. Surrounding the house were office buildings created in the 1980s for the fellowship's headquarters. So on the left here is an older image of the Wiehle Mansion and a more contemporary one on the right. So you can see a lot of the architectural features have remained, with the biggest exception being the porch. There is no longer there today. The AESCULAPIAN Hotel was built by Dr. Wiehle in the 1890s as a part of his health resort. The name comes from the Roman god of medicine and healing. The hotel had 35 rooms and featured several outdoor porches. It was used by Washingtonians who took the railroad to get here specifically to use the springs on the property. A guide created in the 1980s claims that the monthly rate to stay was $30. In the 20th century, it was used by the FAIRFAX hunt for balls and breakfasts. The hotel was damaged by fire and was demolished in 1956. After Wiehle, Dr. Hugh Hutchinson, who was a Herndon dentist, purchased the property in 1908 for $23 an acre. He formed Cuthbert Land and Development Corporation for farming, dairy, poultry, and lumber with William Crichton. He cleared the land and built farm buildings on the property. After World War I, Crichton would sell his interest back to Hutchinson, and Hutchinson's health was not always very good, and he decided to take an ocean trip for his health in 1924. However, this did not solve his ailment, and while he was on the trip, his ship actually made a stop in Boston. He felt very ill and was taken to a hospital where he died at the age of 54. After Hutchinson's death, his wife and 3 sons kept the land intact until they sold the property to A. Smith-Bowman Sr. in 1927. In 1923, under Hutchinson's ownership, the area began being referred to as Sunset Hills, and of course today, Reston has Sunset Hills Road. A. Smith-Bowman Sr. was a successful businessman several times over, having owned an 8,000-acre wheat farm in Canada, and he also created a bus system in Indianapolis that he sold for more than 20 times his initial investment of $65,000. In 1947, he would purchase the former Dunn tract, reuniting the property. The Bowman family started using the land for farming. However, after Prohibition, the Bowmans started producing Virginia Delman whiskey, which would hit the market in 1935. As a part of the distillery, they converted the Wiehle-era town hall into a warehouse for the bourbon barrels. Bourbon was manufactured in the distillery between 1933 and 1988. On the screen here, we have the distillery, but also some Wiehle era buildings. So here on the right, we have the WNOD, the lakes. This is the Wiehle Manor, Bowman House, DeMoss House. And these were the buildings used for the distillery. The remaining distillery building is located on Reston Avenue. It was built originally under the Wiehle ownership in 1892 and was used as a town hall and a church on the top floor. The steeple was home to an 80-pound bell. The town hall ceased to function in 1909, and between 1909 and 1927, the building was used as a store. It was owned by Mr. Eldred Thompson, who ran a general store on the first floor, and his family used the upstairs as their living quarters. Thompson's daughter actually contracted the Spanish flu in December 1918, and the building and all of its perishable stock, including the candy ordered for this holiday season, was quarantined, something we're all a little familiar with right now. During the Bowman era, the building no longer had the steeple. Since they started to store bourbon barrels in the building, they felt that it was a little inappropriate to store bourbon in a building that looked like the church. So they removed the steeple. The building still stands today and has been placed on the National Register of Historic Places. In the late 20th century, it was considered for an exhibit space. Later, a B&B was proposed, but none of these ideas ended up coming to pass. Here we just have a few more images of different buildings that were a part of the distillery. And here we have some artifacts from the Reston Historic Trust and Museum's collection. On the left here are Virginia gentleman labels, and we'll talk about it in a moment, but they very much were influenced by the Fairfax Hunt. For the Fairfax Hunt, men wore red jackets, which are featured in this ad, and then fox hunting is featured in this one, which the Fairfax Hunt was started by A. Smith Bowman. Here in the center, here's a whiskey sample bottle, and on the right, this is a photograph that was taken that we have in the museum's collection of some bourbon whiskey barrels. So the Fairfax Hunt began by A. Smith Bowman Sr. in 1928. Bowman was an ardent fox hunter, and although he began the Fairfax Hunt, hunting was not new to Fairfax County, as that can be traced back to colonial days. Other hunts in the area included the Centerville and Washington Hunt. The Fairfax Hunt would be recognized by the MFHA, which is a hunting and social organization, and in the 1930s, the club attracted the social elite of Washington. Originally, the Fairfax Hunt was held at the Bowman House, but in 1951, it moved to a location near Lake Fairfax. The article that is featured here on the screen is the Reston Times from 1967, and it talks about the annual race of the Fairfax Hunt. And it states that the award for winning the race was the Bowman Bowl. On the slide here, we have the DeLong Bowman House, which is on Bowman Green Drive. You can see it today. It was originally built in 1941 and belonged to A. Smith Bowman's son, DeLong Bowman. DeLong would operate the distillery with his father and also was a host of the Fairfax Hunt. In the early 1960s, the house was used by Reston's founder, Robert E. Simon Jr., as he was planning Reston. And in 1977, the building was closed by Gulf Reston to start being renovated in the 1980s into an office park, which it still is today. Here we have the Bowman Chapel. And although it's called the Bowman Chapel, the building dates back to the Wiehle era. It was renamed the Bowman Chapel after A. Smith Bowman Jr. and DeLong Bowman restored the church, and they renamed it in honor of their parents. The building is not around today, and sort of a theme going on here. The building did burn down in 1972. In 1952, A. Smith Bowman Sr. died at the age of 84, and the property passed to his son, A. Smith Bowman Jr., and his brother, DeLong Bowman. The brothers envisioned creating a city with homes and 1,500 acres of parkland, but their dreams were not realized. Fairfax County zoning ordinance made no provision for that type of community that they were planning, and there were concerns about installing a sewer system and what risk that would pose to the Potomac River. In 1960, the Bowmans sold the Sunset Hills property to LaCroft Realty, but the developers soon encountered similar problems and immediately began to seek to resell the property. Reston's founder, Robert E. Simon Jr., would purchase the property in 1961. The distillery, however, would remain on the property even as Reston grew. The distillery would remain in Reston until 1988, at which time they moved down to the Fredericksburg area. We've covered the history of the ownership of the land and some individuals, and so now I'd like to cover some elements and other buildings that relate to Reston's past. There are many natural features that predate Reston that we're going to touch on. The land, as we discussed, was used for farming and lumber, and as we can see here, Reston began with an abundance of trees. And of course, while Reston has 4 man-made lakes that were created after 1960s, several water sources predate Reston, including Snake Den, Difficult Run, Glade, and Colvin Run. It was these natural features that really attracted Robert E. Simon Jr. to purchasing the property. We have a wonderful quote by him where he said, "What persuaded me to buy this piece of earth was the serenity and the gentle land, half in the woods, traversed by clear running streams." Another water source, Lake Fairfax, is a man-made lake that predates Reston. The first owners of record for this property were John Warner and John Grant, who were granted adjacent tracts of Difficult Run by the Northern Neck Proprietary in 1731. Over the years, the property changed many hands before it was owned by Mark S. Crippen Jr. and his wife Irene, who purchased the property in the 1950s. In 1958, Crippen proposed the construction of a dam to create a lake approximately 20 acres in area, and Lake Fairfax was created. Over the years, the Crippens would continue to develop the property as a recreational area. In 1966, the land was conveyed to the Fairfax County Park Authority, who own it today. When Reston was founded, residents and planners alike had access to several roads. While it was only a direct route to the airport with no on and off ramps, the Dulles Toll Road was in place. Other major roads in the area consisted of Route 7, Reston Parkway, and Route 606. Here on the slide, we have a map from 1966 that was created by the USGS, and it shows those roads in place. Brown's Chapel was built in 1879 after Reverend Augustus and Sarah Brown deeded half an acre of land to the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1874. It remained in use as a chapel until 1967 and was originally located at the corner of Route 7 and Route 606. It was moved to its current location by Gulf Oil in 1968 to accommodate the expansions of Route 7. At one point, the building was considered as a place that could be a school, but today it is used as a meeting space and is operated by Reston Association. The museum has a shingle from the church in our permanent exhibit, so next time you stop in, you can see that. It's inscribed and discusses a shingling project from a 1898 renovation project. In 1853, the Alexandria, Loudoun, and Hampshire Railroad, which would become the Washington and Old Dominion Railroad, or the WNOD as we affectionately call it, was established. The company purchased 45 acres of tract as a right-of-way for the railroad, and this split Thornton's property into fairly equal portions. The first passenger service between Alexandria and Leesburg was in 1860. And that same year, a railroad station was built and was also used as a post office. The expansion of the line, however, was halted with the outbreak of the Civil War. And while it didn't expand, the railroad would continue to operate until 1968, when it was bought by what is now known as Dominion Power. Later, it was purchased by Nova Parks to use as a hiking and biking trail. The first segment of the trail would open in 1974, and the 45-mile trail was completed in 1988. So on the slide here on the left, this is an image of what it looked like when it was in fact a railroad, and on the right, we have what it looks like as a trail today. Mentioned in a previous slide, the train station can still be seen on the WNOD trail today. Left, we have a mid-20th century image of it. So this is the station here. This is actually Old Reston Avenue, and you can see the Bowman Distillery building here in the back. And on the right here, we have images of how it looks today. Reston is a part of the Hunter Mill District, which has its own historic origins. Hunter's Mill was an actual mill that was located east of Snakedon Branch and north of Difficult Run. The mill was known as Hunter Mill as that was one of the owners, and it was a 3-story stone mill. If you're interested in learning more about mills, I encourage you to check out Colvin Run Mill. It's not far from Reston. It's just right off of Route 7, and it's a 19th century mill that's still in operation today. So to conclude, Reston's past includes much of what we find familiar today: an abundance of trees, man-made lakes, unique architecture, and people with a vision. It's a history that has been honored throughout Reston in our street names and the preservation of historic sites. The majority of tonight's presentation used images that are in our archives at the Reston Museum. If you'd like to browse our collection, you can do so on our website, restonmuseum.org. And while you're there, I encourage you to check out our digital history map online that we launched last year. It features 34 locations in Reston, including some of which we discussed today, a brief history of each place, and over 100 archival images. And I hope you'll also consider becoming a Reston Museum member. Memberships assist us in creating free events such as this one, and keeping the museum free of charge. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Before I take questions, I do also want to invite all of you to join our next virtual program, which will be March 10th at 7 p.m., same time. We're partnering with Teffer Institute of Contemporary Art, and we'll be talking about their over 45-year history of being in Reston. So we'll put those links in the chat. So now, thank you for coming. So let's talk about some questions. Carolyn, did we get any questions?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
I did put the websites again in the
Oh,
chat.
okay, great. Great, great, great. Well, if we don't have any, okay.
Okay, here we go. Here's one from Marty Gertz. Can you give an example or two of Civil War history in the Reston area?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, it was just troops moving through. I think the closest was the Battle of Drainesville. And, you know, I don't really know specifics about that. That's a really good question.
Mm-hmm. Here's another one from, looks like Margaret Emerson.
Yeah.
Is there any plan for the Bowman Distillery building?
Not that I'm aware of. I think it was last sold in the 2010s, and I'm not sure what that owner had in mind. Okay, and
Okay.
yeah, the hotel. Ooh. So we had, where was the location of the hotel? I wasn't actually able to find an exact location for the hotel, but if we go back a little ways, it's most of the Wiehle stuff, all was kind of in this area. So it would have been around here somewhere.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we did record tonight's presentation. So we do have plans to get it online. So check our website, and it should be up there within the next week or so.
Great. And I don't know if you can see this question, but it says, check out Jim Lewis's book, War Between the Lines for Civil War History on Hunter Hill Road. That's cool. Thank you for that.
That's a good resource.
And then Christina Alcorn has a question. I have a quick question, more of an observation. I've never heard the Hutchinson connection to Reston. Is this the same Hutchinson that the school in Herndon is named for?
You know, I'm not sure. It might be. I was just looking at that, so I'm not sure, but I think I can get Christina an answer.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Wiehle house is still occupied. There is the Wiehle Manor that was turned into the office park.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is another Wiehle residence that is still an actual residence.
Oh, and I found online that the high school is named for an Edwin Barber Hutchison.
Oh.
It was a former teacher and principal during the 1900s. So.
So the original pond, that is on the corner of Old Reston Avenue and American Dreamway. So if you're over there, you can see the pond. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't know the reason why the BOWMAN'S moved their distillery. I'm not certain about that. And the evidence that we have of Native American presence in this area is largely due to archaeology findings. So, for example, we have the Piscataway Point in the museum. So it's mostly archaeological evidence. Okay, well, it looks like the questions are wrapping up, but if anybody thinks of further questions, feel free to reach out to us. at our email or stop by the museum. And thank you all for coming tonight.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.